Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm glad you all are here. I'm coming to you live from my office at Lipscomb, which is a very good feeling. I believe that we are going to go on and get started, and if participants want to trickle in as we go, we certainly can. Okay, so the topic of today's webinar, as you all know, is navigating workplace communication challenges. We have some polls built in for today, so you can be interactive should you find yourself feeling bored, which hopefully that's not the case. And we are just going to talk about the very challenging and different landscape that we find ourselves in. And we're going to talk about this from three perspectives. So hopefully everyone here can find something that relates to them, what's going on at their workplace or in their professional lives. Number one, we're going to talk about how an organization should communicate with external stakeholders. Second, from the perspective of a leader, how you can communicate with employees. And number three, how you can communicate with your superiors. Now, what's interesting about crisis communication is that every crisis is different. Every set of players, every set of circumstances. And so the way that I developed this presentation was just truly from the basic crisis communication research. So I'm going to give you just some overall ideas and strategies, and some tips, what the research says, so that hopefully you can take that and apply it in the way that best suits you. For example, as we find ourselves in this COVID or post-COVID situation, I would say probably still COVID, even though we all share the same cause of this crisis, it is different in everyone's workplace. So let's get started. And we are first going to talk about communicating with external stakeholders. So first, what is crisis? There are a lot of definitions out there, a couple of definitions: a major occurrence with a potentially negative outcome affecting the organization, company, or industry, as well as its public's, products, services, or good name. Second, specific, unexpected, and non-routine events, or a series of events that create high levels of uncertainty and threaten an organization's high priority goals. All right, so let's practice our polling. Poll number one, before we really get into this: how many of you have witnessed poor communication from an organization during COVID? Okay, I'll give you all another few seconds to vote. All right, so most of you said that you have. A few of you must be doing business with really excellent organizations. You'll have to tell us at a different time. So let's talk a little bit about this. When we talk about how to communicate during crisis, what crisis communication scholars would call the base is just the basic information sharing. So as we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides, when we look at crisis, we say, okay, what is the primary, what do we say initially, and then what's the secondary communication that's more strategic? And I would say, as we look at COVID and all of the many implications and the duration of this crisis, at this point, organizations can have crises that are coming from how they've handled the initial crisis and how they're dealing with COVID. In addition to that initial response and secondary crisis communication, we have what crisis communication scholars say is the base. And all that means is just the information, repeating the information and giving necessary information related to action. This isn't necessarily strategic, but even as we look at base communication, there are good and bad ways to approach this. When you look at how to communicate with your external stakeholders during a crisis, the messages have to be as simple as possible and consistent. So this could be that you want visual communication and you want, if you see, if you're wanting everyone at your organization to wear masks and wash hands, as we see a lot of the CDC material, you have visuals and very simple, consistent messages, a timely release of information, especially if anything is changing because of the crisis. It needs to be leader-based, exhibit expertise, and not necessarily expertise about COVID. Remember, you may not necessarily be communicating about COVID itself, more about how your organization is dealing with COVID. So what your organization needs to do and what modifications need to be made to manage this crisis. Remain honest and open. And part of that is to acknowledge what you don't know. And again, it doesn't have to be about COVID, but if you, for example, don't necessarily, I know at Lipscomb, we don't know completely what will happen in the dorm situation. We know a lot of it, but some of it we're just going to have to wait and see. Situations like that, it's okay to communicate what you don't know. What you don't want to do is have, of course, mixed and conflicting messages from multiple sources. That's confusing. You don't want to have a late release of crucial information, especially if you look within your peer group or your competitor group. If they're communicating about their plans and you are not, that's not necessarily a good thing. Anything that's overly reassuring. At this point, if you're saying, we've got this, we are 100% safe from COVID, well, of course, that isn't necessarily true for anyone. So while you want to be reassuring, you don't want to be overly reassuring. You don't want to be paternalistic. You definitely don't want to talk down to your stakeholders. Don't, talk about unaddressed rumors or myths, or any kind of power struggle within the organization. So where are we now? Again, in this COVID environment, we've got primary and secondary communication. We've been with COVID for a while. So for the rest of this section, we are going to kind of talk from this lens. So what you see here in the yellow, this is from the CDC. Ironically, this is pre-COVID. This is just information that they published just about how to deal with crises, and they normally come from a place of natural disasters, public health crises, and they break crisis down into phases. And so what needs to be done during each phase. And so they present this as a cyclical or a phase scenario. Now, I would argue that in COVID, this is cyclical. We are going to oscillate between initial crises, maintenance, and resolution over and over until we pass this. Because at this point, it may not necessarily be that our crisis, it may not be COVID, but how we're dealing and how we're responding with COVID. And if we have another, every change that comes as a result of municipal actions, government regulations, and we as organizations have to change our response at that point. And so communicating and restarting all of that is a cyclical process. So when we look at this from a research informed perspective, we have this primary crisis response. So if we went outside the COVID environment, that would be, let's say, for example, it's a tornado. Your primary response is immediate. What happens? Who needs to evacuate? Where do you need to go? Your secondary response, which is where we are in COVID now, if we go back to the tornado example, would be, how long is cleanup going to take? What structures will need to be rebuilt? How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to keep the rest of the community safe? So that's kind of where we are now with COVID. Now, the two key scholarly pieces of crisis communication work that I want to address here are situational crisis communication theory and discourse of renewal theory. Situational crisis communication theory is the leading, it's probably the most recognized academic work on crisis communication. And what the scholars who developed this tried to do was to say, okay, if this is your situation, here is a prescribed course of action, almost like a branch system, because the problem, as you can imagine, when you really sit down and try to study or do research on crisis, is that every crisis is different. So, we have best practices and we have things that crisis communication scholars say, okay, you should always, of course, communicate timely, have leader-based communication. But when it comes down to really having evidence-based research on the best way to handle a crisis, that's almost impossible because everyone is different. So the closest that we have is this idea of situational crisis communication theory. Here are different types of situations and the best ways to respond based on empirical data. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about this discourse of renewal theory. All right, so a couple of pieces of good news. First of all, when we talk about situational crisis communication theory, what these arrows mean is that this is rooted in the idea that it's called attribution theory, but from there, and the way that we specifically apply that to crisis communication is that as an organization's level of responsibility goes up, so does the blame of the stakeholders and the level of reparations and level of accommodation that they expect from the organization. So what most of the research about stakeholder compensation and stakeholder gratification says is that it takes a lot less to make stakeholders happy if the organization did not have any part of creating the crisis. So in COVID, that's a good thing for most organizations. But of course, you know, at this point, it's about how your organization has dealt with a crisis, not necessarily the initial crisis itself. And then the discourse of renewal theory is just this idea that opportunity is built into each crisis and using crisis situations as a way to make the organization stronger. So let's talk a little bit about these more in detail. All right, so as I said, just to review, situational crisis communication theory is this idea that different types of crisis call for different types of response. And the way that this is laid out is that the level of the level of responsibility an organization had in creating the crisis calls for a greater level of response. So this is kind of these crisis, the authors of this work develop these different crisis types and different response strategies, all built in. All of the response strategies are rooted in this idea of image repair and how to repair the image of the organization. So crises in which the organization is the victim, natural disasters, rumors, any kind of workplace violence, or any kind of external product tampering. Accidental as challenges, technical error accidents, technical error product harm. An example of this would be Toyota, the big Toyota recalls that occurred a few years ago with the gas pedal sticking. Then you have the preventable cluster, and these are human error accidents, human error product harm, organizational misdeeds of all kinds. And so that would call for the most aggressive response from the organization anytime the organization had fault in actually creating the crisis. So of course, the initial COVID situation, I mean, there's not necessarily a type in this framework, but it would most closely simulate a natural disaster. Every organization is a victim of this. No one, of course, had any responsibility in creating this. However, if your current phase of communication with your stakeholders is the way that you have handled COVID, you are going to handle COVID, I would just encourage you to revisit this and remember that if you make some kind of error in the way that you deal with COVID, or you have to change something, that you may not remember all of the nuances of this framework necessarily, but I would really encourage you to remember the two arrows that I showed in the last slide. Just this idea that the more responsibility your organization had, the more that stakeholders expect. And so if you have to get to a true apology or compensation stage. And then once the previous slide was about primary crisis response. And so at this point, all organizations should be in secondary crisis response strategy. Most organizations choose to handle this from a bolstering standpoint, meaning that they are just trying to bolster the view of the organization in the minds of stakeholders. So reminder, when we look at not necessarily image repair, but the ways that the image of stakeholders can be bolstered. Reminder, telling stakeholders about the past good works of the organization, ingratiation, stakeholder praise and how they've coped with the crisis, how they've helped you cope with the crisis. And then also victimage, just reminding stakeholders that the organization is a victim of the crisis too. In addition to situational crisis communication theory, another really important piece of crisis communication work that's very relevant to the current COVID environment is the shorthand for it is renewal discourse, but it's technically called discourse of renewal theory. Very simply, this is just the idea that there's always opportunity embedded in a crisis. So this was developed after situational crisis communication theory, and it was really to extend beyond this idea that there's always fault in a crisis. I know that the situational crisis communication theory did have kind of that victim cluster where it's not necessarily the organization's fault, but this situation, the COVID situation, truly is outside of any organization's control. And so this makes renewal discourse very, very fitting. It's one of the more optimistic of all of the crisis communication bodies of literature because it's not necessarily about, salvaging the image of the organization. It's about actually improving the organization because crisis almost always necessitates change. And if leaders of the organization are intentional about recognizing that change, it can not only improve the organization, but it can improve stakeholder awareness, stakeholder appreciation if those changes are communicated. So it's always focused, renewal discourse is focused on recognizing any issues that are brought to light because of the crisis, fixing those issues, and then improving the organization and telling stakeholders about it. So the key aspects of this body of work, it's all about embedded opportunity, organizational learning. What has your organization learned? It's a focus on stakeholders. It's always got to be leader-based. And anytime that stakeholders can have a choice in how to move past the crisis and how to improve the organization, that's optimal as well. All right, so a couple of examples of renewal discourse that I will give you. The first is from the 2008 financial crisis. While, of course, the 2008 financial crisis has a totally different set of woes, a totally different cause, a totally different set of concerns, I would bring to light that it was almost as widespread as far as organizational impact. It did impact people on not as much as this, but on a personal level as far as, retirement portfolios. So it's not a straightforward comparison, but it was, probably in recent history, the closest parallel to the current situation just because of how widespread it was. So this is from a content analysis about how Goldman Sachs, which is a big financial firm, communicated after the 2008 financial crisis. And so these are adaptations from their letter to shareholders in which they were really positive. They focused a lot on how the organization was going to improve and move past this crisis. There are some quotes here that they chose to use about how the organization has changed and how they, are primed to move past this crisis. An example from the current crisis, Microsoft actually published in Harvard Business Review last month a self-study about how their work from home, their new, of course, work from home policy that was unexpected, as most organizations were, has changed the way that they're working. And it was really interesting. Of course, they have a lot of data to do that kind of self-study because their technology gives them a lot of self-reporting data. But, they embrace this idea of renewal discourse quite a bit. They talked a little bit about how they were going to have the opportunity to learn about work itself, how they wanted to improve employee well-being, and how they're going to improve as a result of the crisis. All right, second poll. Have you seen any organizations embrace opportunity for change or growth during COVID? That's great. So everyone said yes. So this is a good thing. So if you are a leader of an organization, hopefully you can continue and move that forward. All right, so key takeaways from this section. Number one, handle your base communication effectively. Again, your base communication is just your instructions. There's still a way to do it well though. In those secondary phases, be strategic. Understand the perceptions of organizational responsibility. Not for creating COVID. We all know that it's no one's fault, but understand how your stakeholders perceive your response to the crisis. And then focus on opportunity. And again, from the very beginning of this section, expect cycles. Until this is over and everything constantly being in flux, expect cycles of crisis communication and to have to go back to those initial and secondary responses. All right, questions from this section. Give you about 30 more seconds just in case anyone thinks of anything. Nope. Okay. All right, let's move on. So the second section in this presentation, communicating with employees. If you are a leader. Oh, see a question. Did you think that Goldman response was on track? Thank you, Megan, for your question. Yes, I did. I actually did a very robust analysis piece that I published in which I compared the Goldman Sachs response and the Morgan Stanley response. There was they called it, a lot of the analysts call it the weekend Wall Street died. It was kind of that weekend that all of the bailouts happened and the banks were behind closed doors all weekend, and how those organizations responded differently. And Goldman Sachs was one of the banks that was left standing at the end of that and fared the best financially. So the short answer to that question is yes. Thanks for your question. Anything else? Oh. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about communicating with employees. If you are a leader, obviously your people who are looking to you for leadership are in a completely different place than they were 7 or 8 months ago, as we all are. And there's a lot of things that go into communicating internally. Poll number 3. Do you believe that a crisis, going back to our last section, do you believe that a crisis, even if the organization did not create the crisis, can harm employee morale? I really wish that I had Jeopardy music and I would play it right now. Just play it in your head. Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. Of course, in this COVID environment, even though your organization did not create this, it can of course harm employee morale. Just like the last section, I'm just going to give you some kind of frameworks, academic or empirically based, research-based frameworks, just to kind of help you think through some possible directions for your own internal communication. All right, so this is a lot on one slide. I apologize for that. But when we kind of look at internal crisis communication, we have a lot of literature, a lot of research just about internal communication as a whole from an HR perspective. There is not as much about internal crisis communication. Most of our crisis communication literature is focused on external communication. So what we just talked about, external stakeholders, how to salvage the reputation and the goodwill towards the organization. There's not quite as much about internal crisis, which, as you all just confirmed, and we all know that of course this can harm employee morale even though the organization did nothing wrong. A summary, I compiled a lot of research for you just to kind of give you some thinking points about this. When we look at internal crisis communication and what you actually need to say, you kind of got this grouped into objectives and contents. So when you look at objectives during internal crisis communication and what you actually say to your people, either from a team standpoint or the larger organizational standpoint, you can kind of break it into this cognitive, affective, and behavioral. So when we look at what are employees looking for cognitively, of course, first and foremost, they need to have uncertainty reduction. That is number one. Uncertainty either about the crisis itself, if that's not possible, about the organization, the solvency of the organization, their role in the organization, but also at the same time increase realistic expectations. If there is going to be a big organizational change, if there is going to be a change in pay, if there is going to be a change in roles, if you can't communicate about that, at least give a realistic time frame for what you can, when they will hear about those things. And of course, part of that is really trying to the best of your ability to tune into whatever kind of rumors are floating around the workplace. And enhance a sense of security. Again, not a false sense of security, but enhance a sense of security. From an affective, so cognitive, of course, from a mental standpoint, reduce uncertainty, increase realistic expectations, and enhance a sense of security. So from an affective or an emotional standpoint, this is a time of high emotions, and not necessarily that you need to emotionally engage with your employees, but there are a lot of opportunities to increase identification and trust of the organization. If you weather this crisis really well with your employees, it can be a really great opportunity to just increase employee loyalty by doing a good job with that kind of internal communication and create a sense of belonging. I mean, going through a crisis together can be a good way to help employees feel like, they did make it through a crisis and they were valuable enough to the organization to stay put. And then behavioral, what are your actual behavioral objectives of your crisis communication internally? So to sustain employees' commitment to their roles and to overcome the crisis, and any kind of desired, if there are actual desired work behaviors or crisis management behaviors, of course, that's a goal as well. If you want people to do something related to COVID with hygiene or protective, practices, but also if you're wanting people to do something different with regard to work, of course, you have to communicate that. And then as far as so those are your goals, but as far as your contents and actually what to say, again, if we kind of group these into categories: informative, identification, and factual. So informative, what is actually happening to your organization because of this? Data and dissemination about the situation of the organization and its perspective of the future because of the crisis. So identification, again, this is where you want to bring in, if there are any values, anything about the culture of the organization that can make it any kind of relationship with the crisis, whether it makes you more vulnerable to the crisis, hopefully whether it makes you more primed to deal with the crisis. If you're a faith-based organization, it might be a really good time to, for example, talk about how that's something that's going to help you deal with the crisis as an organization. And then the factual, what are the actual facts and actions needed to face the crisis, and any kind of tangible signs, any kind of progress, any kind of benchmarks that you've achieved as an organization dealing with this crisis. And more, so that's a more general approach. COVID specific concerns, and some of this is from the literature that I reviewed, in this previous slide, and also some of this is from some of the more recent Harvard business pieces this summer. You've really got to be diligent about clarifying performance expectations versus circumstances. For most employees, their circumstances have changed in some way. They're either working from home, they've got children at home, they are, maybe they're not at home, but someone that they work with is suddenly at home. A lot of things are shifting. So just understanding that remote working, it may not necessarily decrease performance, but it can change the flow. I encourage you, if this is something that's happening at your workplace, to look at the Microsoft Stealth study in Harvard Business. They talk a lot about that, about how they're just the way that they work has changed, the hours during which they work have changed. And so as a leader, communicate that flexibility in time does not necessarily mean a flexibility of expectations. While your expectations still may be high, there of course is a more, even when everyone, just because everyone is remote, it can create the, you may peak at 11 where you used to peak at 9, or you may peak again at 3 instead of, 1 o'clock, whatever that time difference is in your workplace. Embrace internal communication messages and build community whenever you can. People will still find a way to create community. It's just going to look different in an online environment. This is the example from this section. There was again, back to the 2008 financial crisis. This was a study following that of 60 Italian companies and the way that they communicated internally during the crisis. So the research about this was obviously a broad survey, and they talked to managers and had employee focus groups. What they found was that internal communication was largely underutilized, which is really a missed opportunity, because as we, the last poll that we had, you all realized, this was a 100% agreement that, of course, crisis can harm employee morale. So not doing this and not embracing internal communication can be a real misstep. And one thing this study found that I would also encourage you to do if you're a leader is to use informal channels. Of course, the company, the communication from the company itself is really important. If you're a leader, use those informal communication channels, talk to your people, set up a way for them to have a chat, to have a virtual, discussion. What employees are trying to do is to engage in sense making, to make sense of not only the crisis, but the organization's role in the crisis and how it's responding, and all of the changes to the organization and their place of work because of this crisis. So make sure that you're using those informal channels on more of a ground level, in addition to helping your organization, because I know a lot of managers right now are having to help their employees make sense of what the organization as a whole is saying, but also make sure that your employees have a way to help make sense of the crisis, not only with each other, but with you. And then of course, managers need support too. So if you need more support, make sure that you're making that known. And then always check in with employee understanding. All right, do we have any questions from this section about communicating with employees? No? Okay. Let's move on. All right. This is our last section. It is about how to communicate with your supervisors in this brave new world in which we are all living. All right. Poll number 4 of 5. If you have had a difficult conversation with your boss, have you found it more or less challenging during COVID? Okay, good. So some of you are, so I have 63% saying that you have found it less challenging. That's interesting. Maybe that maybe tough conversations are easier over the phone than face-to-face. And then some of you are having this more challenging. And I would be really curious to know if it's a format thing or if it's a timing thing. It's harder to find a time to talk. Let me give you a little bit of this material, and then in the question section for this section, please feel free to elaborate or ask any questions you may have. All right. Of course, everyone's situation is different, so I am going to offer you the tried and true, just a basic negotiation framework. When you go into having a difficult conversation in COVID, just like before COVID, you've got to have a really clear idea of what you want. What are you trying to solve? Okay. if you are like 95% of people, you are feeling some kind of emotional stress or emotional change during this situation. If you cannot clearly articulate the answer to this question, what am I trying to solve? If you are approaching a conversation with your boss or your superior, just double check that this isn't an emotional response to something going on with COVID, something going on at your workplace because of COVID. So, simple negotiation framework. What am I trying to solve? What authority do you have to make firm commitments? Who else do you need to approve the plan? What are your interests? What are their interests? What is your BATNA? What is your best alternative to the negotiated agreement? What is their BATNA? What implementation problems are likely to arise? And what are your negotiation goals? Okay, so poll number 5, final poll. Which of these points of negotiation framework are likely to be at your organization? Which of these points of negotiation are likely to be impacted by COVID? Has your best alternative changed? Have the people, the levels of decision making changed? All right, take a couple more minutes. All right, I somehow did not get the answers to those. Okay, oh, there they are. Okay, so looks like interesting. All right, so the most common response, which makes sense, has to do not necessarily with your own goals, but who has to, I would assume there are more layers of approval, or those are different just because workflow is changing. Interests looks like they've changed, and some implementation problems. Just anecdotally, it's an interesting place to be if you were about to go up for a promotion, or you were about to ask for a raise, or you wanted some kind of big ask, and then COVID happened. And it may not necessarily lessen your chances, it's just going to make things a little different. So I would highly encourage you to think through this diplomatically, before you broach any big conversation or any big ask. Use the negotiation framework, and then also just consider these COVID specific concerns. Of course, there are a lot of competing priorities. Again, every organization is different. All of the spin-off situations because of COVID, and everyone's workplace is different. But there are probably more competing priorities than there were pre-COVID. So just understanding the timing, it may not, we don't know when COVID's going to end. So if you are underpaid, or you are ready for that next step or that promotion, or you need something to change, whatever the situation is, it may not be realistic for you to wait until after COVID, but I would encourage you just to think about kind of that life cycle of the crisis. And while you may not can wait until the entire COVID situation is over, maybe you could at least try to time your request at a time that it's you're at least between spinoff crises from COVID. Understand the translation of your skill set to a remote environment, or if it's not remote, whatever's going on post-COVID with your workplace, try to understand how your skill set has translated and bring that into the negotiation with you. Understand, are there new opportunities? or alternatives if it was some kind of promotion or advancement request. If your boss's work circumstances have changed, if their pay has changed, if their own opportunities for advancement have changed, it's just a reasonable thing to consider. Not that you necessarily change your course of action, but just to understand their frame of reference when you go into the conversation. Going back to the Harvard Business Review piece, that was one of, at least at Microsoft, that was one of their big findings, was that mid-level managers caught the brunt of a lot of what was going on with COVID, because they were having to manage their teams and get their teams working in an entirely different way, but also having to translate a lot of the messages from upper management, having to report a lot to upper management about what their teams were doing. So, if that's a situation at your organization, keep that in mind too. Of course, organizational circumstances. If you're about to ask for a raise and there have been massive financial implications because of COVID, obviously that's something that you need to consider when you think about broaching a difficult topic. And then the actual conversation planning itself. Of course, tough conversations or sensitive conversations with tech issues are even more so. So of course, I try to consider all the technical aspects and make that environment as stable as you can. If you've had an opportunity to demonstrate competence, anything, just anyway, but also if it's something that is going to showcase your skill set in a post-COVID situation, and then any kind of work patterns. If the person that you need to talk to is suddenly doing, a lot more of their work in the afternoons or the nights, try to, think through those factors as well. All right, questions about this section? Or questions overall? Okay, that is it for today's webinar. Thank you for tuning in. Feel free to email me if there's anything else that I can answer or elaborate on in any way. It's just ll.dillingham@lipscomb.edu. Good luck out there with all of the changes or whatever is going on with you work-wise and professionally. Take care and have a good day.